Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's a warm welcome to you all for joining the webinar today. And my name is Zurei Zhen. I am the Program Manager and Global Coordinator for ICLEI Sustainable Mobility. And in today's 1-hour webinar, we'll be talking about the good practices for low carbon freight in Asian cities. And I see there are still participants joining the webinar, so we will be starting anyway because the podcast or this webinar will be made available online shortly after this webinar, well, subject to the technical difficulties. And in today's webinar, we will go through the brief introduction on ICLEI and the Ecologistics project. Then I will hand over the screen and also the floor to our speakers of the day, Ian Wainwright and Boyon Wang. And for them, they will have 15 minutes each, and that will be followed by Q&A periods for about 20 minutes. And we will have a final conclusion for 3 minutes, and that will be finishing in 1 hour's time. And this podcast and also this webinar wouldn't be made available with the help of colleagues at ICLEI and also the Ecologistics project. And for those who don't really have enough knowledge about ICLEI, and ICLEI is actually a global network of 1,750 cities, and also regional governments that committed to sustainable urban development in various different regions. And globally, we have 23 regional and country offices working with 1,750 cities and subnational governments, and across 100 countries, working in ICLEI's low carbon development, circular development, and human-centered development, resilient development, and also nature-based solutions. And transport is in particular a cross-cutting themes across these developments and these pathways, serving as the fundamental services provided by cities and private companies, and also all the stakeholders to keep the city moving and to keep the commerce moving and also keep our everyday life moving without any disturbance. And therefore, for ICLEI, we work on the sustainable urban freight as well as sustainable passenger transport. So for these ecologistics projects, which is information is available online, that will be available on our ecomobility.org website and also through our project partners website, which is currently funded by IKI, which is the BMU by German Federal Ministry. And this ecologistics project and looking into actually 9 cities in 3 countries to build the strategies and also policies to promote low carbon and more sustainable urban freights in the urban areas. And hopefully through this project, we'll be able to implement demonstration projects and also to reduce the GHG emissions in these 9 cities that would sort of increase the quality of life for people living in these urban areas. So for today's speaker, it's our great honor to have Ian Wainwright, who is the Director of Future City Logistics based in London, UK, and also Boyon Wang, who is the Director of Strategic Relations of Smart Freight Center China, based in Beijing and China. So without further ado, I would hand over the screen and also the microphone to Ian.
Hello, and thank you very much for the introduction, Zurei. So we had a webinar a couple of months ago, which is available online, to talk about some of the processes and some of the issues around urban freight. So today, talking about a lot more about sort of some of the examples of where some cities have managed to do it better than perhaps others. Firstly, a bit of introduction, as both Boyong and myself are working with Smart Freight Centre. Smart Freight Centre is a global non-profit organisation working towards low carbon economies and bringing together really the global logistics community. So working with the businesses and the shippers and the carriers, which is important because as we're looking at how cities potentially can influence freight, it's important that the two elements of how the shippers and the carriers are working and how the cities work are in sort of, consistent with each other. And with a growing world's population in urban areas, and not just the mega cities, cities over sort of 100,000 people and above, it becomes more and more important that to address carbon and climate change, that cities take action themselves. So in theory, there's a load of solutions that are available, whether they're regulation, whether they're last mile solutions, electric vehicles. So the vehicle on the top right is a 24-ton electric vehicle, or even sort of technological solutions. But one of the problems really seems to be that we sort of forget about the volume of goods that we need to carry. This happens to be a picture of Hamburg, the largest port in Europe, but you could go to Shanghai, you could go to any city in the world, and any port city in the world, and see thousands and millions of containers. And this is what we're trying to move around and into urban areas. And we often think that a cargo bike can solve the last mile. Perhaps it can, and that picture is from the Netherlands and is 100 years old. So a cargo bike is not necessarily new, but it's how we join the link between the volume that we're trying to move in and the last mile. So to try and explain some of the examples of good practice, you can go to a number of different locations and find examples and experience and people saying this is the thing to do. But as you look at some of this, part of it is to try and understand how that fits with an individual city. So in the UK, in Europe, there's been a lot of work on sustainable urban mobility plans and individual plans on logistics as well. In the US, there's been lots of work recently from the Federal Highway Administration. Individual cities have got examples, there's case studies, there's pilots and projects, and if you go online, you can find thousands of different types of solutions. And Smart Freight Centre has their own, which is about transport manager training, which is really to try and ensure that transport managers in operations have the ability. But as a city, how do you work your way through that? So one of the things that I think is to partly understand is what the city is trying to do. What are the city outcomes? Where are they aiming for it? Because this is important as well, particularly to deal with the politics within the city. And very often, while globally we're trying to deal with climate change and carbon emissions, the big issue is often air quality at a local level, along with safety and congestion and improving the economy. So reminding ourselves that air quality is important as well as the CO2, we then say that actually there's a bit of a hierarchy of how cities can, and those cities that appear to be tackling freight really have started to think about things. Firstly, there's a clear strategy which links transport and land use together, and that is looking at both people and goods. And then there's really something about trying to sort of look at the hierarchy of the freight solutions. So rather than just looking at an electric vehicle or a cargo bike, so to mitigate the impact of the last mile, there's very much a need to sort of move beyond that to looking at the demand for freight, where and when it is moving, and make sure it fits the location and the network, the road network particularly, because 90+% of freight in an urban area is on the roads, and really trying to minimize the number of road freight trips. So when we start to look at things like modal shift and land use planning, those are the things that can really change the way the cities of the future can actually obtain and move freight and logistics at the last mile. So having a safer, cleaner, quieter vehicle is great, but we need to think about some of the bigger issues. So when we look at some examples of some of the strategy, and I've just taken 3 of the areas, so land use, timing of deliveries and safety, to look at how 3 cities have dealt with those issues. So in terms of strategy, Stockholm is a city of about less than 1 million people in Sweden, and what they did is back in 2014 they came up with a very clear vision of the city, how they wanted the city to work, and through that there's then a series of junior documents to that, which is the city land use plan and then an urban mobility strategy. And within each of these strategies, there was really a series of individual elements. So the freight plan that was initially introduced in 2014 was alongside a plan looking at cycling, was alongside a plan looking at how buses move. So each of these elements were dealt with individually, but as part of the overall strategy for the city. And by looking at 4 very simple goals and having some dedicated resource and a short time frame to their plan, what they've been able to do is move beyond their initial set of goals. So now in the city, there is another freight plan, which is for 4 years, but effectively it's moving the target on, because what they identified was they couldn't tackle everything at one time. If you take a different scale of city, so Seattle on the west coast of the USA, they initially, when they started to look at their freight plan, looked at actually who was going to be spending money and which government agencies and regional agencies were going to be looking at the future for how the city developed. Because one of the issues there was to look at how freight was going to change, was look at all the other elements that were going to change in the city. The city's also worked up a partnership with the University of Washington, who are based in Seattle, who have what they call an urban freight lab, which is working with local businesses to ensure that freight is delivered, and the academics start to research some of that urban freight and the last mile activity. So by looking at that connection between somebody to research it, the city and what they're doing, and who else is investing in the area, and through engagement with those people, the city's been able to develop a freight master plan, which is part of the overall city development plan. So by looking at some of these elements in a little bit more detail, if we take land use in Paris, Paris has been looking at urban freight for probably over 20 years. And they have experimented with a whole range of solutions, some of which have been more successful than others. But through that experimentation, they've gained a real clear understanding of the link between land use and the transport element. So they now have a very clear sort of outline plan for how logistics should happen in the city. And this is very much in the core part of the city, looking at sort of multimodal logistics platforms around the edge, which are the larger dots on the map. So cross-dock locations to be able to move the goods into the last mile, which may be a cargo bike or an electric vehicle. And then a series of pickup and collection locations that are available in sort of every neighborhood to enable residents to access goods if they're not around for delivery. And recognizing that land use is a key element of this activity seems to be very important in that delivering a clean, carbon-free last mile. New York has done work in the last 9 years or so, looking at what they call off hours, which is really timing deliveries when the road network is quieter or the curbside is quieter. And that balance between traffic flow and the curbside use is incredibly important. So the initial pilot in 2010, working with academics, again, but actually sort of paid retailers to take deliveries overnight, particularly away from peak periods and in key areas. So the academics had done work which basically said to make the number of deliveries that need to be made, the curbside just basically there isn't enough hours in the day. So by changing some of the existing regulations and by now having a sort of dedicated team of people in New York and a sort of a clear dedicated web page to enable people to access this, they're now able to start to increase the number of deliveries that are occurring overnight. And if we talk about the vehicles that are involved, so a lot of work was done in London looking at particularly safer vehicles. And this sort of approach can apply to cleaner vehicles as well, because what they identified was what's the impact of those vehicles in the urban area. And although heavy goods vehicles, so the largest trucks over 18 tons gross vehicle weight, only make up 4% of the traffic, they were contributing 63% of cyclists and 25% of pedestrian fatalities. So by adopting a sort of a holistic approach, looking at safer drivers, vehicles and operations, they targeted driver training, they targeted what the driver can actually see out of the vehicle, so what the vehicle shape is like, so that's the two pictures at the bottom. They have a thing called the Freight Operator Recognition Scheme, which is working with the companies and the operations to ensure that safe operations occur. And then the city and various public bodies within London now procure through what they call work-related road risks. So they actually have a procurement process where public money will only be spent with logistics contractors who are ensuring they have safe drivers, operations and vehicles. So looking at how everything is done. So this is the same with clean vehicles. You can do clean vehicles in terms of making sure the vehicle is well maintained, but also that the driver understands driving in a fuel efficient manner. So by way of sort of conclusion to my section of this webinar, I think it's just sort of worth going back to some key elements which I identified at the end of the first one, which is really making sure that there's a freight vision that incorporates land use and transport, that the approach is coordinated, maybe with other cities nearby, but certainly with other cities and urban areas and regions. And I think that's what's important with the Ecologistics project, is really looking at how to coordinate some of this activity within countries, but also sharing some of the ideas. Collaboration with stakeholders is not optional. A lot of the time people believe they can just regulate. You can't just regulate for freight. It's a lot cheaper for starters, and a lot more effective if the operators understand it as well. And while there may be a desire to tools and data and modelling, some of this is about taking some action now. We know around the globe that there are examples of things that work. Some of this is about just getting on and do it. And experimenting and being flexible, because technology will change. Technology will not solve the problem. If we have an automated vehicle, it's not going to suddenly not have a problem in terms of fuel use, unless we change the fuel, unless we encourage the driver and there's somebody to receive it, and. So this is about how we experiment and remain flexible. So that's it from me. I will pass you back across.
Thank you very much, Ian, for the very comprehensive information about the best practices in cities in Europe and also in North America. And also to mention, you also touched upon the important elements of how to really bring together the stakeholders in different sectors, and how cities and also stakeholders should embrace the change, and also in the meantime maintain flexibility. So it's just a quick reminder to everyone that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website, which is ecomobility.org. And also another reminder is that if you have any questions, please leave your questions in the chat box and in your pens, which is, I believe, is available to anyone. So shoot us any question you have, and we have colleagues sorting out the questions, and we'll help our panelists to answer the questions should you have any of them. So without further ado, I will hand over the screen and microphone to Boyan, who's again the Director of Strategic Relationships, Smart Freight Center China, based in Beijing, in China.
Thanks, Mr. Chen, for the nice words, and also it's a great honor for me to have the chance to enjoy the smart freight or urban freight in China and also Asia Pacific. As Ian has already introduced, I'm working for Smart Freight Center China office. We have been entered in the China market in 2014, and we have been working very closely with the government, with the industry, and especially with the multinational companies in China. So today I'm going to give a bit of flavor of what urban freight in China looks like, and also touch a bit of what's happening with Asia Pacific. And as everybody knows, that we having now a really big increase in urban population, but also the economic activities in the urban area. So we have 3.9 billion people living in urban area, and now that occupies 54% of the world's population. And there are around 500 cities with a population over 1 million. And we can see the latest projection shows the growing urbanization combined with population growth will actually have a big influence for the urban freight in the future. And then the next, you can see with the example in China, we see the Chinese freight volume actually keep a pace of 14%, 15%, and there's 87 times compared with 1980. So with the last dozens of years, we can see in China itself, urbanization and economic growth actually transformed the economy, but also the whole freight sector. And this actually, if you look at Asia and China, particularly in China, for the last 10 or 20 years, we are showing a figure now from 2014 to 2009 up to 2014 up to 2017. You'll see a large amount of investment actually put in China and in Asia infrastructure that actually bring about a big change. We can see there's expanding Chinese highway network. The Chinese network has 4 times quadrupled in the last 20 years. By the end of 2018, we can see the length of China's expressway network actually reached 142,000 kilometers. This is the world's largest expressway system. And secondly, China has built up a high-speed rail. Its length is 2/3 of the world. So with an average 300 kilometers per hour, this high-speed rail is used not only for passenger transport, but start to apply to the freight sector. We see a big change in infrastructure. That actually means that China does not only build up a world-class high-speed rail, highway expressway system, but also out of 10 world's largest ports. And mind you, in the 1980s, there's nearly 0 freight airport. But up till today, China has 229 freight airports. However, with a quick upgrading of the infrastructure, we see a lot of challenges in the urban freight. This including, of course, the very fragmented sector, lack of harmonized approach and leadership, over capacity and over competition, and especially this urban freight has actually bring a lot of externalities, meaning this is disproportionate environment impact. So urban freight only takes a small percentage of the volume, but it creates a large portion of PM 2.5 and the other pollutants. We take a glance of what's happening with Asia. We can see the logistic cost as a percentage of GDP in Asia is around 15 to 25%. And in China itself is 14.6%. This is compared with Europe or the US, which is always below or around 10%. And secondly, we can see the trucks or the road freight always occupies a big section of the logistics sector. It's about 9% of the real population, but you can say the emission is 54% of the CO2 emission. And with the trend, we can see in Asia, the commercial vehicles, every 1 in 2 commercial vehicles are sold and used in Asia. So therefore, we see a booming freight sector, but also an increasing of the population in Asia. This we zoom in the Mekong region in Southeast Asia. It constitutes only 16% of the road freight, but it generates around 50% of the CO2 emissions. And it is very congested. Well, it's very heavy congestion in Bangkok, in Ho Chi Minh City, and the other large Asian cities. This is an overview of the CO2 emissions across the world, and we can find out in China, in India, and other Asia countries, we can see logistics and freight takes a big portion of the CO2 emissions. In China, particularly, this reflected in the big cities. You can see that in large cities like Beijing, like Shanghai, Hangzhou, or Shenzhen, the mobile resources, the mobile source pollutants is increasing. And this will getting worse and worse, simply because we are projecting by 2050, the freight volume will expand another 4 times. So the challenges is huge. 10 out of 25 most congested cities in the world is in mainland China, and the large number of trucks is increasing. So we're projected up till 2050. There will be much more heavy duty vehicles going to get on the road. It is highly inefficient. So the miles, the travel distance in China, for example, for heavy duty vehicles is significantly less than in Germany and in the United States. In Asia, the empty running is usually 40, sometimes even 50%. So it's highly inefficient. And if we look at the current status in China, there's a structural imbalance, there's low efficiency, and because China really opens up in the 1980s, the market rule, standards, and procedures are far from established. There's a picture of what's happening or the current status of this industry. It is fragmented. It is the average carrier of 10 Chinese carrier owns 1.7 to 1.9 vehicles. So this industry is actually made up of more than 90% of individual driver owners. So we see these 2 pictures. On the one hand, you see the quite advanced infrastructure. On the other hand, we don't see the rules, the procedures is far from established, and there's overcapacity, there's over competition. So what are the solutions and practice? We have already identified from more micro level, vehicle, trucks, to the system level, from the whole transport infrastructure and transport system, to tackle these issues, to decarbonize logistics. However, we have to say this is very specific to policymakers and also to the industry. And these are the solutions that we recommend to the Chinese government. They have to take the market access regulations, you have to provide subsidy, you have to provide the regulations on land use. So this is a whole series of solutions. And in China, we give some examples that we want a scrappage of the old vehicles. We are having a tighter regulation on fuel, but also to curb the pollutions. We're banning the heavy-duty vehicles from downtown areas, especially big cities like Beijing, like Shanghai. And especially during the last 2 years, the Chinese central government is asking a structural change of transport mode, because 76% of the Chinese freight was actually carried by road. And now we are trying to shift this transport from trucks to rail. In large Chinese cities like Shenzhen and Shanghai, the electrification of urban freight vehicles is getting more and more serious. Shenzhen, for example, is banning diesel urban freight vehicles. All of the taxis in Shenzhen is now electric. And of course, there's other measures, including the promotion of cargo exchange platform, and also overall develop urban freight strategy, which I will explain a bit later. If we look at the other Asian cities, in Cambodia, they're banning the heavy-duty vehicles. They are actually also have restrictions in Myanmar and in Bangkok and in Ho Chi Minh City. So there's a trend in terms of getting the heavy polluted, especially heavy-duty vehicles, out of the city. But while what's the efficient urban freight is still a question mark. So therefore, the solutions need to be carefully developed. And this is a piece of work that Ian and also Smart Freight Center has been working with Chinese cities like Beijing. So we're actually studying the solutions and also the best practice across the world in the other cities like Paris, like Tokyo, like New York, to develop an urban freight plan. So we actually studied the lessons from the other cities. We actually had a careful study of the solutions and methods, but also mentioned by Ian, and that's also experience for Beijing, for example. This has to be tailor-made to the Chinese and Asian cities. Ian has already mentioned there's examples in New York, for example, this off-peak deliveries. And we see this practice also happening in Beijing. And for example, IKEA is also in discussion with Beijing municipality that to move some of their transport to off-peak hours and to deliver that at night. So in summarize of the experience we have in China, we think the industry hold the key to change, especially the multinational companies, the multinational shippers like IKEA, like Lenovo, H&M, the big brands, because we think the trigger lies with the business, and they have the power to take actions across their supply chains. So in China, we have been actually working together with the multinational companies and also the other key stakeholders, especially the government, to achieve these goals of sustainable development and also to implement the solutions just now we discussed across the transport system and also across the sector. So we are linking the industry with the government in cities and also in the long-haul transportation. We're talking about the modal shift. We're talking about the best practice in cities of our delivery, transport, from the trucks to the rail, shifting the trucks from the truck to the rail, and the electrification of the urban freight vehicles. So those are all the solutions that we're talking with this key stakeholders. I'm going to quickly go to conclusions and takeaways for this. First of all, in summarize the experience in Asia and China, we want to make a careful assessment and balance among all the solutions we have been identified, because we have to really care about the emission potentials and especially the takeoffs of the private sector. For example, while we can question whether if we banning all the heavy duty vehicles out of the city, that might create really big problems, because, for example, are you really transporting all your trash with this light vehicles rather than use one, for example, heavy duty vehicle to do that? And secondly is to link actions to policies. For the city governments, you need to provide a clear standard, legislation, and even develop programs, economic instruments to encourage and help industry to take actions in terms of improving the fuel to get a cleaner fuel, cleaner vehicle, and also adopt efficient technologies. And this is only one example of how you take from a micro level that a carrier can actually take. And most importantly, to team up, seeing you need to work together with the stakeholders. It is not an option, it is a must, as mentioned by Ian as well, that this effort also has to build on the existing ones. For example, there's already green freight programs in Beijing, and we need to ride on that. And we need to balance the quick gains and long-term goals. And this need a proper mobility plan or even a freight plan. We need to link the carrots and sticks together, meaning the government has to provide the incentives, but also regulations. Develop KPIs to monitor what's happening. And in talking about the trend, and we can see urbanization and freight, it will evolve, it will getting much more worse with the economic growth, the challenges and opportunities both existing. And the externalities, meaning the negative impact on health, on pollution and emissions, will have to drive the future change. And especially for diesel emissions, this becoming a big factor for Chinese cities and Asian cities to really improve and take on. So that's my presentation, and thanks for your attention. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Boyon, for very comprehensive, even for background studies about the staggering amount of environmental externalities caused by freight and logistic industries in China, but also in Southeast Asia, which is also quite surprising to me, that given the fact that the economic growth in Asia, in that region, and the logistics industry in terms of the sustainable approaches and measures are still playing catch up. So we have a few questions coming in just now, and which, even though we're addressed to different speakers, and I think they are actually applicable to both of the speakers. And so to start with, I would like to ask Ian, but also Boyon as well, because in both of your presentations, most of the best practices and case studies are done by major cities such as Seattle, London, New York and Beijing. What about the non-primary cities, such as the secondary cities or cities that are not that resourceful? Would there any suggestions, or are there any current undergoing programs to kind of better kind of fit or better serve these smaller cities? Probably we could start from Ian.
Thanks for the question. I think part of the issue has been why is it that it's the more developed cities? Partly because they are more developed, and therefore the things that you tend to ignore become more obvious. Freight is essential to what we do, but if you asked most transport planners to stand on a street corner and talk about the traffic that's in front of them, they would talk about the pedestrians, they'd talk about the cyclists, they'd talk about the buses. They may talk about the cars as in we want to reduce them, but they'd probably ignore the freight. And I think that's partly because nobody's ever traditionally been taught about freight or to look at freight. I think it's now that we have, if you like, the generic data that says freight is a problem. It's starting to rise up a political agenda. I think that's the incredibly important part of this ecologistics project, is starting to understand this. But examples from smaller cities are starting to exist, but that's again through sort of these sorts of networks of sharing some of the best practice, sharing the ideas and the issues. I've been involved in a project that was sponsored by the European Union, which was particularly trying to get some of this logistics practice into cities in Eastern Europe, which are a lot less developed than sort of the Parises and Londons of this world. But I think it's partly just trying to understand people have got plans. I understand Beijing have now worked up a plan, but it's obviously got to get approval. And then I think we've got to be able to access that information. But I think partly it's trying to talk to people who've had that experience and understand it. If you go back 10 years, in the States, they really didn't understand some of the stuff and came across to Europe and asked lots of questions. But it's how you apply, to an extent, that matrix, but the principle of the avoid, shift, improve at a local level. I think that's how you do it. But as soon as examples are there, I'd love to be able to start using them from anywhere.
Thank you, Ian. So for Boyoung, what about the second tier or third tier or even smaller cities in China? Are they catching up on these the policies and regulations on sustainable urban freight?
Well, for China, most of the cities in the global standard are quite big already. But I think with this quick urbanization process, freight is getting more and more focus from the policymakers. The reason is, even for the second tier cities, pollution would be always a problem, because this is not only constrained in one city or even in one area. And secondly, even for small cities, the increase of the consumption volume and also economic activities, meaning the increase of not only passenger transport, but also freight. Well, as we know, in China previously, freight is a Cinderella, meaning like it's not really getting into the attention of the policymakers. But as the congestion is increasing, and also the request, but also objective of second-tier cities to develop that into people-friendly, environment-friendly cities, they are actually taking solutions, especially they want to learn the experience from the other cities, from the European cities. So this actually we see, for example, in Yantai, in Handan, the second-tier cities, they have already sending delegations to Europe and also to the other Chinese cities to take solutions. For example, a better land use and develop non-motorized traffic, and also properly plan their freight route to make the city more sustainable and clean. And especially there's a trend of reintroducing the bicycle into the cities, building up more bicycle lanes, for example. So we see this is happening. However, we do, as I described, see both the opportunities and challenges exist. Thanks.
Thank you, Boryong. And the next question is actually the conundrum of the ecologistics and also sustainable urban logistics or urban freight, which is, for both of you, Ian and Boryong, where do you think a city policy maker to start from, say, when after they get to know the importance of having a sustainable urban freight and sustainable logistics industry, where should they start? And also, what is actually the buy-in for different stakeholders, how to convince the stakeholders to be part of the movement? Maybe could start from Ian again.
Okay. Yep. Another good question. I think the first possible thing is to try and get some clear understanding of what the city's long-term goals are, because the second thing that you have to do, if you like, is go and talk to some of the stakeholders. There has to be an early discussion with some of the shippers and carriers, some of the businesses that are receiving freight, some of the other regulators, bearing in mind that we're dealing with vehicle sizes, weights, drivers' hours, a whole series of things which will often be regulated but perhaps not well enforced, and is really trying to understand where there's commonality, because what cities want is they want, very often, it's air quality, it's safety, but that can often come down to congestion. They want a more reliable road network for the traffic that is moving. Hopefully it's good, it's low carbon traffic, but whatever traffic's moving, whether it's bikes, whatever. And businesses who are delivering freight need reliability of the journey time. They need reliability of how long that journey will take, because they can manage for it. And that, at the very essence, is the two things that the shippers, the logistics companies, and the cities both want, is they want a reliable road network. So there is a common purpose, but it's about how the city recognises what its policy is and how the stakeholders recognise what their policies are, perhaps not stated as policies, and how you bring those two together. So the city needs to know what it's doing, needs to go and talk to stakeholders, and then it's about evolving a program, a policy, a strategy or something that starts that process off. Now, that may be very low level. It may be about a particular street or a particular area, a neighborhood. But in a sense, you've got to start somewhere by actually having those conversations. And part of it is going and having some conversations as a city planner, going and having conversations with the operators, saying, I'd like to come out with a driver for a day and see what happens on urban deliveries. Start to understand each other's problems, and that will start the conversation.
And thank you, Ian. What about Boryong? Do you have any sort of thoughts on this question as well?
Well, I think I second Ian's opinion that there has to be a conversation and the dialogue between the industry and the government, the policymakers, the land planners, for example. And that's precisely the experience that we have here in Beijing, for example. Since Beijing has introduced the new policies, for example, ban the heavy-duty vehicles out of the sixth ring road, and you can only enter into the city, for example, from 12 o'clock up to 5 in the morning. And then there's definitely, from the industry point of view, a need to discuss with the government, depending what the government's objective is, because it could be more cleaner air, and it also could be congestion. It could be also reach the goal of more safety. So you really need to talk with the government in order to get these objectives, what we need to do. One example is, for example, we want Beijing to have more clean air. Therefore, the government is recommending or encouraging the adoption of new energy vehicles. And then in this regard, the solution would be whether the industry and the government can have a discussion saying, if the industry taking a more cleaner vehicle, well, e-trucks, for example, is that possible that we can relax the curve, saying instead of from 12 to 5, can the new electric vehicle enter into downtown area at 11 o'clock because it's not polluted? So this is just one example of how the government and the industry should work together.
Thank you, Boyon. Very interesting kind of comments and also answers from both Ian and Boyon to see on this pathway to sustainable logistics is actually an ongoing and never-ending negotiation between stakeholders, in particular governments and private sectors. And one last question. It's actually, we have in these ecologistics projects, we also come across a few comments from our cities as to how to revive a different type of mode of transport, such as railway and waterway. So my question is also to both, but maybe starting from Boyon first, as to would cities in China, intercity logistics, with the authorities or private companies consider shifting the road transport to the freight transport from road to railway?
This is actually a very complicated issue, but on the other hand, we do see the determination of the central government saying we need a blue sky. We need to shift the transportation from truck to rail, because Chinese trucks, well, simply because of the negative externalities of the heavy-duty vehicles, for example, and also because, as I presented, China has developed a quite advanced highway or railway network. But that being said, how get the government to work together with the big shippers? When we say big shippers, we were talking about the cargo owner of coal, of steel, and also the shippers like IKEA. So, well, the Chinese central government is quite strong. They have actually already set up a target, saying, for example, we are going to move 25% of the transport volume in the Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei area from truck to rail. And then the next one would be for cities and province to implement. And then they need to discuss with the shippers. One example is in Beijing, for example. Beijing municipality actually had studied several possibilities of building up a logistics center that connects the rail to this logistics center. Well, they had discussed with the land planner, and then there is logistics center that is possible to link the rail there. But the question is somebody going to use that? Well, you cannot set up a logistics center and without any shippers like IKEA, like the Chinese steel to get there. So, and we know the logistics always lies in the hand of the private sector. So it's IKEA who's actually owning the cargo. So that's where actually what we're doing in Smart Freight Center is actually bring the industry to talk with the policymakers in Beijing, for example, so that we can jointly work out programs and also policies, subsidies, and all the other tools to make this happen. So I think, yeah, this is only one live example of how this can work from truck to rail, because in the end, the IKEA, Chinese railway, and the government need to work together. In a way, saying, even IKEA saying, I need my cargo to be there or in a week time, while the Chinese rail saying, in the next week, I'm busy finishing or completing the government assignment of shifting the coal. So it doesn't work. So you have to have all the stakeholders to sit together to talk this through. That's the solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Boyon. And we're a little bit running out of time, but it would be really appreciated to have a short and sweet response from Ian about the alternative models for freight to ship from road to, say, waterway.
I think, as Boyon said, if you can't get it to work in China, we have to ask the question that says it's not necessarily about the government. It's about understanding the origins and destinations, and I think it will be about flexibility. So if you take rail, one of the issues is, yes, it has traditionally been used for bulk transport of things like coal. Perhaps there's a way of getting it more flexible, so it is used for passenger movement during the day, and it's used for freight movement overnight. You know, so it's sort of using the same rolling stock, and that certainly is what some of the rail companies in Europe are starting to do. So I think the principle is, you know, is there a way of utilising it where it's people and goods together, and maybe a more sensible way? So if we take, for instance, automated vehicles in the future, again, could they be pods that could be used for people or goods? And I think this is the understanding of how we build sustainable cities. People are now waking up to the fact it's not just about people movement, it's about goods movement as well. And mobility and how the city functions needs to include both the land use and the transport. So I think I'd leave it at that.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Ian and Boyon, for being the panelists for today's webinar, and this webinar will be made available shortly on the ecomobility.org website, which is available, which is shown on these slides. And thank you for joining the webinar for today. And so thank you once again, and have a good start of the day or the rest of the day. I'll see you in the next webinar. Thank you.